One of the reasons why I've chosen the idea of transformation and to title the exhibition in the Ruskin Gallery Transformation, and also the piece that's going to be the public art piece around the new Science Centre, is in a way it kind of exemplifies, it highlights the fact that transformation is at the root of everything in life, and that we have to adapt, and things are always in a state of movement and change, and we may as well celebrate it and enjoy it.
The idea of transformation is something that dates from ancient times, particularly in association with the source, or one of the sources for this particular exhibition, which is Ovid's great poetic, epic story of creation and history combined, called Metamorphoses. This was a tremendously important source in Renaissance and Baroque art, and in particular, one source that we went back to in Rome, which is the famous statue by Bernini of Apollo and Daphne from around 1622 to 25, in which he depicts the moment at which the nymph Daphne is touched by Apollo, who is enamored of her, and she is unable to reciprocate his advances, and prays to her god, her father, Peneus, to transform her into a laurel bush at that moment. And so it shows very convincingly and extraordinarily movingly this moment of change when her hair becomes leaves and branches, and her roots grow out of her toes, and her skin becomes bark. This idea of transformation is an exploration not only of the way that the universe and nature itself involves change, sometimes quite arbitrarily and cruelly, but also an understanding, I think, of the way that our imaginations can change things from one thing into another through the power of metaphor, likening one thing to another thing that might be quite different. And that power of imagination has had a long-term appeal, but perhaps less so in contemporary art. And this is why Annie Cattrell's transformation project is such a revelation to me, that we're going back to this classic source to produce contemporary art which is interdisciplinary, which involves both dance, modern video techniques, digital motion capture techniques, but also three-dimensional printing, 3D printing, to produce some of the iterations of the sculptural artwork.
So I was introduced to Charlie Morrissey and Andrea Buckley at the Siobhan Davis Dance Studios, and they are both dance artists. They choreograph their own work, and they work together sometimes, and they also work separately in all sorts of different ways, and perform and do workshops and so forth. And we met at Siobhan Davis Dance, and we tried to develop this project which Marius Quint had originally been discussing with me about responding to the Apollo and Daphne sculpture by Bernini at the Villa Borghese. And in 2000 and 2001, I spent about 4 months at the British School in Rome, and I continuously went to the Villa Borghese to see those sculptures, and I was particularly struck. And I was really struck by how extraordinary, when you look at it and you kind of imagine Bernini carving back this huge, big, enormous chunk of volume of marble, and then kind of bringing out this extraordinary depiction of Daphne and Apollo. And so the story is extremely important about Daphne and Apollo, but it's also that it exemplifies this idea of metamorphosis, and how she tries to transform herself into a laurel bush to, in order to get away from Apollo, who's chasing her. So when we all arrived in Rome and we went to the Villa Borghese to look at the sculpture together, I was really struck by how the dance artists, Charlie and Andrea, kind of circumnavigated the sculpture continuously and then almost started to try and adopt the position that Daphne and Apollo would be in. And so it was kind of curious to see how they reacted. So I was watching them looking at the sculpture, which I knew quite well, having spent a lot of time looking at it in the early 2000s, and then watching them respond to it. So using film for the first time, working with Francis Scott, who's an artist and a filmmaker, has been a really kind of revelatory experience. So we're capturing things using time, essentially, and filming and sound, which hitherto I haven't been able to kind of get in previous works.
For the exhibition Transformation, the main exhibit, which is a multi-channel video artwork, it shows two dance artists performing in response to the statue of Apollo and Daphne by Bernini, which is in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. And their interpretation was based on a study process that took several days and involved all sorts of looking intently at the sculpture, discussing it, sketching it, moving in physical emulation to it. And then afterwards in the gardens of the Villa Borghese and also at the Villa Il Cardinale to not quite reenact, but to simply respond to what they had seen using this historical source and seeing how that experience could be kind of refigured through their bodies and also their understanding of the story and the idea of transformation or metamorphosis. And we then captured their motions when they re-performed this piece in the digital motion capture studio at the University of Portsmouth, and the data from that are informing the creation of a new sculptural work by Cattrell, which is using the new technology or relatively recent technology of three-dimensional printing.
Today we used a process called optical motion capture using a Vicon camera system. There's 20 cameras in all that track the movement of the reflective markers on the performers' bodies, and then from that we can produce animation data in various different formats from their movement. Well, the technology is used for capturing human motion as accurately as possible. And there's so many different applications for that we use for animation, film, television, games, and more for arts projects. And that's what we're really keen is to cross over and use the data in new and interesting ways, because it can be used in so many different ways and different people have different requirements. So we can adapt the data to fit the client or the project that we're working on.
The exhibition Transformation is a precursor to the installation of a public kinetic artwork by the artist Cattrell at Anglia Ruskin University's new Science Centre. It is a work that constantly changes in accordance with the conditions that surround it, the wind, the rain, the sunlight. It is about change, about movement, about the dynamism at the heart of our natural world and in the universe at large, and the way that science often changes the conditions of things, of materials, of living organisms in order to understand their behaviours and their natures.
This is the base panel that we use to clad the building, and this is what the anodised aluminium squares get attached to. This is a welded aluminium frame, powder coated grey, with an aluminium composite panel that's been CNC cut with the hole pattern stuck on the front. Okay, so once the panel's been assembled, these hard anodised aluminium brackets, which hold the little coloured plates, are riveted into the CNC cut holes in the face of the panel. The coloured aluminium plates are then clipped into the brackets on the panels according to a pattern that's set by the artist, and they're then held securely but allowed to pivot freely so they can blow in the wind. The completed panels, they're built inside these travel crates, and we're building them in the reverse order of installation so that when we get onto site we can remove them in the correct order and put them up without too much extra handling.